Picture a 16-year-old girl, somewhere on the African savannah, 40,000 years ago. She wakes up one morning and finds blood on her hide wrap. Nobody sat her down beforehand. There was no older sister with a diagram, no elder with a gentle explanation prepared in advance. In that instant, she is dealing with something that has never happened to her before, using information that essentially does not exist yet. Here's what makes this genuinely strange to sit with. That exact moment happened to nearly every woman who has ever lived. Not most, nearly all of them. It is arguably one of the single most universal experiences in the entire history of our species, right up there with birth and death. And yet you could read an entire shelf of history books about ancient civilizations and never encounter a single sentence about it. Today, we're going looking for those missing sentences. Before we go anywhere, we need a quick detour into biology, because it explains something that will genuinely surprise you. Puberty is not simply a countdown clock tied to age. In the 1970s, researcher Rose Frisch proposed that a woman's body runs something closer to a survival calculation before allowing menstruation to begin, checking whether there's enough stored energy, specifically body fat, to plausibly support a future pregnancy. Later research has refined and debated her exact numbers, but the underlying principle has held up remarkably well. Your body isn't just counting birthdays, it's checking its own fuel reserves first, which raises an obvious question. If it's about available energy rather than age alone, when did puberty actually arrive for someone living in the deep past? Later than you'd probably guess. In well-fed modern populations, the average age of a first period sits around 12 or 13, but anthropologist Nancy Howell, studying the Kalahari's Kungsan people, one of the last groups still living something close to a traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle, found menarche arriving significantly later, closer to 16. Harder physical labor, leaner and less consistent food, and the sheer energy cost of simply surviving all pushed that threshold back. It's a reasonable, evidence-supported guess that a prehistoric teenager followed a similar rhythm, later rather than earlier than what feels normal today. So try picturing that 16-year-old again, somewhere deep in prehistory, encountering this for the very first time. Here's where honesty matters. We genuinely do not know what she thought. Nobody recorded her reaction. There's no diary entry, no cave painting captioned with her confusion. Anyone who claims to know exactly how she felt is guessing, dressed up as certainty. What we can do instead is look at more recent traditional societies, still living outside industrial culture, and study how they treat this same moment. And across a striking number of unrelated cultures, spread across entirely different continents with no contact with one another, one pattern keeps showing up. A first period is rarely treated as a secret. It gets marked, sometimes through seclusion, sometimes through ceremony, sometimes through outright celebration, but almost always as something significant, something worth acknowledging rather than hiding. We can't prove prehistoric humans handled it identically, but it does suggest something worth sitting with. Treating menstruation as an unspeakable secret looks a lot more like a modern habit than a universal human instinct. Now here's the frustrating part. If you're an archaeologist trying to reconstruct any of this directly, whatever prehistoric women actually used, moss, soft plant fiber, prepared hide, it was organic, and organic material rots. It doesn't fossilize. It doesn't survive thousands of years buried in soil waiting patiently to be dug up and labeled. So if you've ever seen a confident viral claim about exactly what cave women used, that confidence isn't coming from a preserved artifact, because none exists. What we actually have are reasonable, evidence-informed guesses built from materials we know were already part of daily life for other purposes, wound care, general use, and therefore plausibly repurposed here too. Plausible is not the same as proven, and any honest historian will tell you the direct physical evidence simply hasn't survived to answer the question for us. There is, however, one genuinely remarkable clue that predates written history entirely. In Central Africa, archaeologists uncovered a small carved bone, known as the Ishango bone, dated to roughly 20,000 years old, covered in deliberately grouped notches. For decades, it was assumed to be a simple tally stick, but some researchers have proposed something more specific, pointing out that the notch groupings align suspiciously well with a lunar cycle of about 28 days. If that interpretation holds, one of the oldest deliberately patterned objects in human history may be, quite literally, a woman's method for tracking her own cycle, carved into bone with a sharp stone, 20,000 years before anyone invented a calendar for any other reason. Once we reach written history, the fog lifts considerably, because now people were finally putting things down on paper, or in this case, papyrus. The oldest known women's health document on Earth is the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus from ancient Egypt, dated to roughly 1800 BCE. It discusses menstrual irregularities directly, alongside pregnancy and contraception. Treated as legitimate medical territory worth an entire scroll, Egyptian women are believed to have used softened papyrus and separately rolled linen, both materials that were already everywhere in Egyptian daily life, cheap, absorbent, and reusable after washing. Culturally, the framing was strikingly different from what comes later in the story. Menstruation in Egypt was tied conceptually to fertility and to the goddess Isis, echoing the Nile's own life-giving annual flood cycle. Egyptian women were not secluded or treated as dangerous. Life continued largely uninterrupted. Ancient Greece complicates the picture considerably. Hippocrates treated menstruation as a necessary, healthy purge of excess blood, a normal function connected to overall well-being. Aristotle, meanwhile, proposed something almost impressively wrong, that menstrual blood was essentially failed semen produced because women's bodies, being colder and weaker than men's in his framework, simply couldn't finish the job properly. This wasn't a fringe theory. It was mainstream intellectual consensus for centuries, and it quietly reinforced the idea of female biological inferiority in medical thinking across the ancient world. Practically speaking, Greek women are believed to have used wool, formed into absorbent pads or small internal plugs, an early ancestor of the tampon, sometimes held in place with fabric belts. Rome inherited Greek medicine, and then added its own flair for confident nonsense. The physician Galen treated menstruation reasonably as part of the body's overall balance. Pliny the Elder, on the other hand, wrote an entire, deeply serious passage claiming a menstruating woman could sour wine by walking past it, dull blades by touching them, and drive dogs into a rabid frenzy simply by existing nearby. Ordinary Roman women obviously didn't organize their lives around agricultural disaster prevention. They used soft cloth, wool, and sea sponges, absorbent, reusable, and readily available around the Mediterranean. But there's a telling class divide here that echoes through nearly every civilization in the story. Wealthy women had access to fine linen and household help for washing. Poorer women, which was most women, made do with coarser rags and whatever was on hand. Religious law added another entire layer on top of all this. In Jewish law, a menstruating woman was considered ritually impure, restricted from touch until purification through immersion in a mikveh. The laws of Manu in Hindu tradition warned of consequences for contact with a menstruating woman and restricted her from cooking or entering temples. Zoroastrian tradition went further still, isolating menstruating women away from fire, water, and earth itself. And across indigenous cultures throughout the Americas, Africa, and Asia, menstruating women were often sent to dedicated seclusion spaces, sometimes framed as protection from danger, sometimes as recognition of heightened spiritual power during that time. The materials on hand rarely changed. Cloth, soft leaves, whatever tradition provided. What changed dramatically from culture to culture was whether that same biological event was treated as something sacred, something dangerous, or simply something unremarkable. Elsewhere in the world, the story looks considerably more dignified. Traditional Chinese medicine treated the female body as a distinct, complete system, rather than an inferior version of the male one, and menstrual timing, color, and flow became genuine diagnostic tools for physicians going back to the Han Dynasty. Chinese women used cloth pads, silk for the wealthy, cotton for everyone else, held in place with woven belts. In the medieval Islamic world, physicians like al-Zarawi, often credited as a founder of modern surgery, and Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote detailed, clinically serious gynecological texts, treating menstruation as an ordinary medical subject requiring genuine care rather than moral judgment, at a level of respect that parts of Europe would not consistently reach for centuries afterward. Medieval Europe gets an unfairly flattened reputation here. Most working women likely practiced something close to free bleeding, relying on thick wool skirts and dark layered fabric, because stopping daily labor simply wasn't an option available to them. Wealthier women used washable linen or wool rags secured with a belt. Medical thinking of the period, inherited from Greek humoral theory, actually treated menstruation as necessary and healthy, and physicians would prescribe herbs when a period was late, using a category of plants called emmenagogues, several of which we now know do contain compounds capable of affecting the uterus. One extraordinary figure deserves specific mention here. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German nun, composer, and medical writer, described menstrual cramps and cycle irregularities with genuine empathy and clinical precision, centuries before mainstream Western medicine would consistently treat women's pain as real rather than imagined. Then, gradually, things regressed. By the Victorian era, menstruation had become something to conceal completely rather than simply manage. Male physicians of the period wrote with total seriousness that menstruation made women too physically fragile and mentally unstable for education, employment, or public life. This wasn't innocent confusion. It was a deliberate cultural verdict about what a bleeding woman deserved, and the verdict, again and again, was less. Which brings us to something that tends to genuinely surprise people. The convenient products treated today as completely unremarkable are almost shockingly recent inventions. The first commercially sold pad, released around 1888 and marketed as Lister's towels, flopped almost immediately because Victorian women were far too embarrassed to ask a male shopkeeper for one. It took the First World War, and nurses noticing that leftover wound dressing material absorbed blood remarkably well, to accidentally kickstart the modern sanitary pad industry in the 1920s. The modern applicator tampon wasn't patented until 1931, reaching store shelves as Tampax only a few years later. Immediately controversial, with doctors and religious leaders alike raising alarm over a small roll of cotton. Sit with that timeline for a moment. Humans have been menstruating for the entire span of our species, several 100,000 years. The products we now consider basic and unremarkable are barely a century old. A genuine blink inside that much larger story. So here's what actually stays with you after tracing this whole arc. From a notched bone in Central Africa, to a papyrus scroll in Egypt, to a nun writing with compassion in a German monastery, to a cardboard box on a modern store shelf, women were never passive victims of their own biology. Every civilization we've looked at developed practical, often genuinely resourceful solutions, using materials that were already sitting in plain sight, refined and passed down across countless unrecorded generations of women teaching daughters. The available materials were rarely the real obstacle. Wool, linen, moss, sponges, all of it existed almost everywhere. The real variable, the one that actually determined how a woman's life was shaped by this monthly reality, was never the technology. It was always the story a given culture chose to tell about her body, and whether that story treated her as something sacred, something dangerous, or simply something entirely, unremarkably human.